Yo guys, Paunchy here, and today I'm going to show you how to use outboard gear with your Big Six. Now there's a couple different things to keep in mind when you're doing this. Now you can apply the same principle of using outboard gear to the idea of using plugins through your DAW. So all I mean by that is, say you want to get some reverb from one of your outboard units, and say you'd like to get reverb from your DAW instead, you can do that using pretty much the same method. You just got to mess with a couple things here on the Big Six. So let's get started. I will show you kind of how I have things hooked up. Now I have a Boss RE20 actually hooked up to the stereo cue. So in the back here, I have the stereo cue out for stereo cue 1 going to the input of the RE20, and then I have the output of the RE20 actually going to the external inputs right here. So, and then this is 13 and 14. So 15 and 16 here are hooked up to some of my other outboard gear. I won't be messing with that today, but just so you know, that's what I have hooked up there. So I have a Roland Juno synth, let's see, hooked up to the stereo in 7 and 8. That's in the back, which is going to my patch bay. And then, so that's essentially how I have things hooked up right now. So, and then, okay, so what I want to do is I want to get some reverb from the RE20 onto the Juno. So essentially, first thing you got to do once you have everything hooked up is make sure that the stereo cue is on. Of course, you'll see the light there. And then this indeed does control the level going out of the stereo cue out. So, and then you have a pre and post fader there. You'll most likely just want to leave that not pushed in, so that way you're pre-fader. So I actually just turned up the stereo cue all the way, and then of course make sure that your effect or whatever it is on your outboard gear. So I do have the effect on over here. So now let's see what we hear. Okay, we don't hear anything because I have this pushed in. Okay, I also have external 1 from USB 13 and 14 pushed in. And there you have it. Now we have some effects going on. Okay, so now it works. So that's the first step. You want to make sure that it works. The reason I had those buttons pushed in is because I was messing with the plugin thing that I'm about to show you. So the reason they were pushed in is because I had it routing through Logic, so that way I could get effects from a plugin on Logic. So now that we can hear the effect, we want to route it into Logic for recording, because that's the best part about the stereo cues is, you want to be able to record with them essentially. So the way that you get it to go into Logic is with the main section right here. So essentially we have the output of the reverb of the RE20 going into 13 and 14. So you want to make sure that 13 and 14 external 1 is pushed in right here, because that will sum this to the main output. So a couple things you want to look at here. So let's go over to Logic. Okay, So I have a couple tracks here. I have this drum loop. You can hear what it sounds like. I have a couple other things right here, but I'm just going to mute them because I want to do the synths to the drum beat here to kind of show you a practical use for the, using your outboard gear. So I have a couple empty tracks right here. So the first one I want to be 7 and 8. Now what that's going to do, if you try and record this, you will only get the Juno, which is what I have plugged into 7 and 8. You'll only get the dry Juno. You won't get any of the effects because the stereo cue, it's not an insert, essentially. Like you might be, if you're not too familiar with this kind of thing, you might be thinking of the stereo cue as an insert, of which the first 4 channels here on the Big Six are the only ones that actually have inserts. So that's one thing that you want to keep in mind. So, okay. So the stereo cue, we essentially need to record the, you could look at it as the return of the stereo cue through another channel, which is why I have that hooked up to 13 and 14. So if you want to record the stereo cue, which is essentially your wet signal, which obviously is the whole reason we're doing this, you can go over here to this other track and set it, let me disable these plugins here, set it to inputs 15 and 16. So now if we play this, you'll notice you have 2 signals coming in here. Now this is the dry one. I'll name these so that way it doesn't get too confusing. So let's see, Juno dry, or you could just name it, whatever track you're recording. Now this is, the wet signal, or you could just name it stereo Q1. And now the reason for that is because the reason I didn't just name it, Juno wet, is because essentially the cool thing about the stereo cues is you could be using this across multiple channels here. See, because every single one of these has a stereo cue. So, and then you can even also use it on the main channel as well. So that's the beauty of the stereo cue, is because you can take one box, whatever the outboard effect is you want, or outboard gear, and then you can spread it over all of these channels. So if I had a synth on 5 and 6, and then a synth on 7 and 8, and I was using both of the stereo cues, keep in mind that when you record that wet signal coming back into Logic right here, keep in mind that both synths will essentially be going to the same channel. The wet signals of both of those synths will go to the same channel. Now, in some cases, that might be okay. In other cases, it might not be okay. So that's something you just kind of have to keep in mind when you're doing this kind of thing, is that you can only record the output, or the return, I guess you could say, of the stereo cue onto one channel. There isn't a way to, for example, separate the wet signal of 5 and 6 and the wet signal of 7 and 8. So, this would work best if you're just recording, one channel at a time. Or, for example, say you were recording, say you had all of these filled up on your Big Six, like say you were recording like a full drum kit. So you would have almost every channel, taken up with drums. And then say you wanted to, say for example, you made your own echo chamber or something like that. Or you just had an RE20 like I have here. you know, you'd press in all these stereo cues to enable them. And then, you know, that would be a situation where it's totally fine that all of the stereo cue, you know, wet signals are coming through into one stereo pair. So it just kind of depends what you want to do with this. To me, this is great. I love this because I can just add effects to my synths without having to, you know, plug and unplug stuff, because I have all my synths hooked up to my patch bays, you know, and then I move them around accordingly, of course. And then that way I can just add effects at will, you know, to different synths, you know, or whatever it might be, different guitars. You know, you can use the same principle on guitars. So now let's go ahead and record something here so I can show you in action. Okay, so I'm just going to play something to this drum loop I have going here. Okay, that's good enough for now. Okay, let's unmute these. So, well, I'll mute this one first. So this will be the dry signal. Okay, now over here we have the wet signal. Whoops. Okay, let's see. Oh, it's because I have the out going over here to 13 and 14. So by default, it'll be set to stereo output. The reason I had it set to 13 and 14 is, again, because I was messing around with the plugin thing, which is why I have these plugins down here. So I'll show you, we'll come back to that. I'll show you that later. So there you go. You have your wet signal. So interestingly, you know, once you have these two, you know, you could potentially, if you just wanted a wet signal, you don't even have to record this track right here. I definitely just wanted to record it right now to show you guys, you know, the, in case you tried to do this and, you know, you wonder why your stereo cue isn't coming through channel 7 and 8. So I wanted to show you the difference between the two tracks. So, you know, again, if you're just looking for a wet signal, just record the main out here, you know, of the Big Six. So, you know, it just depends on what you want to do with that, of course. So, and then the cool thing about this, if you do record both, you know, you can kind of use this as a blend, as a way to kind of blend it, you know. See, like say for example, you know, there was too much reverb when you recorded it, so you could just kind of turn this down and then just blend the reverb kind of blend the reverb how you wanted it. Oh, okay. So this is where things get interesting too. I didn't mean to record the output of the, you know, essentially the output coming from Logic here, because the drums did end up going on this track. So, you know, obviously that's not what you want, because it's going to end up, you know, you're essentially going to end up having drums on there which will make it louder. So what you need to do is uncheck or unpress this one over here, external 2. I had this pressed in, which what that does is it sums those 2 channels to main, so I don't want to do that. So let's go back and record this again. Okay, and now if we listen back to it this time, you'll notice that there are no drums this time. So that's what you want. And we'll put this back up to 0 here. Okay, so, you know, I'm just gonna go ahead and leave that in there because I just want you guys to see that, you know, the Big Six is fairly complex as far as routing goes. You know, there's so many different ways to route things in the Big Six. So you want to just be aware of everything that's going on at the same time. So I want to leave that in there as a, you know, to show you guys what can happen. So that's why we were recording the output of Logic. And you know, I definitely recommend going to see some of my other Big Six videos if you haven't already. I have one on summing for both Logic and Ableton, and that will kind of tell you a little bit. I also have one on how to set up your outputs and a little bit on routing. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, then go check out those videos. So, okay, let's go back to Logic here. So we've successfully recorded one of these channels here using outboard gear, utilizing the stereo cue. So that part is done. But now I want to show you guys how to use effects from your DAW. Now, it doesn't really matter that I'm on Logic right now. You can definitely do this with any DAW. So let's just go ahead and do it on Logic. But if you do have any other questions about any other DAW, definitely let me know down below, and I'll try to help you as best I can. I probably won't end up doing one of these for Ableton, just because, like I said, it's, you know, the principles are pretty much the same. And especially if you go watch my summing video for Ableton, that should give you enough of a primer to kind of figure out how to get this to work on Ableton. So anyway, let's just go ahead and delete these. Okay, so let's make sure. So we have our synth, of course, our Juno coming in through 7 and 8, so that's good. We'll leave that track the way it is. And now we want to set this one up with some effects. So let's first off go back to your Big Six, and I'll show you how to route it to the computer. So we have the stereo cue enabled for the Juno. Now you need to come over here. This is the stereo cue section. And essentially you want to hit Q1 to USB 9 and 10. So what that does is, if you think about it based on what it says, stereo Q1 is going to go to 9 and 10. So we come over here and we have our stereo Q1 track. Let's set that to 9 and 10. And then, so I'll show you a couple things here real quick. So I have some verb and some echo enabled. So let's go ahead and just try that. Okay, you'll notice that the echo sounds different. Let's try it with just the echo. You'll notice that that sounds way different than what I had set for the RE20, so you know that that's not the RE20. And then I do want that verb as well. Okay, let's go ahead and record the same thing using the Logic plugins. Okay, now let's listen to these. Let's listen to just the dry one. Okay, of course, that's just dry. Now let's listen to the stereo Q1. Okay, so there you go. We officially, whoops, there's Logic. We officially have effects coming from Logic, and they're being used with our Juno. Now you might ask yourself, you know, you could essentially just put those effects here on the dry one, and that is definitely true. However, if you want to use the stereo cue like a normal stereo cue, where you use it on multiple tracks here, then what you essentially have to do is route it back to the Big Six. So you want to come back over to the Big Six here. Well, first off, we want to go back to what I had set before. So our stereo Q1, we want to set this output to 13 and 14. So, you know, try and visualize what we just did with the actual outboard gear, except we're going to do that with the plugins from Logic. So you want to set that out to 13 and 14. So now what we have set up is more like a send and return, you know, that you could set up on any DAW, you know, Logic, Ableton, any of those. You know, the type of send and return you can set up over here and then put effects on that. We've essentially done the exact same thing, except we've created a physical send and return utilizing our Big Six. So now let's go back to the Big Six, and you want to make sure that external 1 is coming from USB 13 and 14. So let's hit that. Okay, now you'll notice if we come over here back to Logic and you mute this, that there's no effect coming through. And then if you unmute it, the effect comes through. So again, I'll just walk through real quick what we have set up. We have the Juno in 7 and 8. We're sending the Juno signal out with the stereo cue, and I just have that all the way up there, pre-fader. We're sending the stereo cue to USB 9 and 10. Now, when it's going through USB 9 and 10, it's being affected by the plugins there, the Logic plugins, the Verb and the Echo. And then we have the output of that channel coming to external 1. And then, so that would essentially be like what we had earlier with the RE20 plugged in physically, except instead of this being 13 and 14, which it technically is, we're actually getting, it's kind of bypassing this, and we're getting 13 and 14 from USB. So that's why we have this pushed in. And then you come over here and we sum 13 and 14 to the main channel. So if you wanted to, you know, and again, the reason I showed you how to loop it back to the Big Six is because if you want to do this with multiple channels, then you're going to want to record the wet signal of all those channels, you know, coming through the main fader. So, well, coming through 15 and 16 specifically. So I hope that wasn't too confusing. That's pretty much it for today. If you have any kind of questions, feel free to leave them down below. You know, I hope this really opens up the possibilities for you on the Big Six, because to me it's amazing. I don't normally actually use the RE20. I do sometimes, but what I actually normally use this for is like, for example, right here, I have some actual outboard gear hooked up to my Big Six, except the way that I have it routed, I'll just, you know, just real quick, I'm not utilizing the stereo cue. I actually have it essentially as, like, you could look at it as like it's an external preamp. So like right here we have 4 preamps, the super analog preamps, you know, and then these are just the line stereo inputs and outputs, and then these are also just line inputs and outputs. Well, in this case they're just line inputs that just bypass the preamp, you know, the internal preamps. So what I have going on right there is I have a Golden Age 573, well, I have a little 500 series rack, and essentially what I use that for is just as like another preamp. So if I wanted to record more than 4 mics here, I essentially use, well, in this case 15 and 16 as an external preamp. And then in my 500 series box, my rack, I have also a DBX compressor and then a DBX EQ. So if I want to plug a mic into that, then it goes through the preamp, through the compressor, through the EQ, and then it comes out into here. So that essentially gives me another way to integrate my outboard gear into here, into the Big Six. However, for example, in place of the RE20 that we use today, you could set it up so stereo Q1 goes out to my 500 series rack, and you know, you could set up you know, compression and EQ that way, and then have that return back to the external inputs here. So, you know, there's many different things you can do with the Big Six utilizing outboard gear. Keep in mind, you can do all this stuff live too. You know, you can definitely use the Big Six as a live mixer. You know, and this essentially, this same kind of concept would apply. You know, you could use, you know, like for example, my DBX compressor and EQ in the stereo cues, and then that way you would get that sound live if you sum it back into the main channel here, and there you have it. So anyway, that's it for today. Hope that helps you guys. Feel free to leave a comment down below. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next video.